good question to ask, probably on everyone's mind, is in Regina, how will we know once things start to get brought under control? What would be the first indicators? What are going to be the signs that all of our collective actions to try and reduce transmissions are actually taking effect? And what we can think about is that our observations of what cases are happening is delayed from what's actually happening for person-to-person transmission, right? Tests are usually done a few days after symptoms start, or at least when symptoms start. Often they're done a few days after people have been exposed to the disease. So we're always sort of lagging behind the event of a transmission and infection, and then the observation of that transmission and infection that actually created a case. So what I've got here for you, this is probably one of my favoriteest graphs, is all of the cases that have been found in Regina, the number of tests that have been done, and the test positivity. So our y-axis here is the number of tests done each day. Date, obviously, across the x-axis. The size of the circle is the test positivity. How many tests were found to be positive? And then if I were to hover over this, we can see that I can also pick up actually how many cases there were found that day, the weekly positivity, not only just the daily positivity. I've got sort of extra stuff stashed in here. So to look at this right now, early in the pandemic, so October through to, sort of the peak of our second wave, what we would call it, sort of mid-December or getting into at least early to mid-December here, you can see that the number of tests that were done starts to go up as more people get sick. And this makes perfect sense. If you're in a community where you have, you've never heard of COVID, you obviously wouldn't be going to get a COVID test. If you've heard that, there's variants raging in your community and that this is something where people should be tested for any symptoms, or maybe you were in close contact with someone who came out to be a positive case, you can imagine people are going to be more likely to go and get tested, right? So one of the first things, or one of the earlier things that we see that sort of tell us how the trends go in the pandemic is initially testing doesn't go up, but not the number of positive tests does. So the size of our bubbles here increases before the height of the bubbles does, because we're still doing the same number of tests in the community because people aren't sort of realizing they should go and get tested. And fewer tests, but more of them coming up with positive makes big bubbles here. Then, as people start to become aware that cases are going up, the testing also starts to increase. People go out and they get tested more often. And this is going to lag. Once we've started to test, trace, and isolate, find those cases and prevent those cases from being transmitted before they create the next generation of cases, people will still continue to be tested at a high rate. And that means even though we might see the same number of cases per day, if our testing continues to go up, with the same number of cases, the test positivity will start to go down. And what we can see is that the size of these circles starts to sort of shrink down as well. And sometimes the size actually starts to shrink before we actually see the number of tests go down. Now I'm going to get rid of old data and just look at January to now. And I'm also going to make myself smaller, because you don't need to see my face that big. So what we've got here are the number of tests that were done in Regina, again, from January on. There's a few days that we saw essentially double testing, where they didn't run them through the lab one day and then they ran sort of a double batch the next day. So that's why there's a few sort of extreme outliers here. But generally we can see that there was 500, 600 tests being done most days of the week in Regina. Some days a little higher, some days a little lower. Some of this has to do with just the day of the week. That's one of the reasons that I sort of color code this, is because then you can say like what's happening on just Sundays. And we can see that there's this sort of nice trend, right? Like Sundays have been fairly consistent, even though if you compare Sundays to Fridays, let's say, like Fridays consistently are quite a bit higher than Sundays, just because of the way that people go to get tested and processed and all that. So if we look at the overall testing day by day here, obvious trend. As people started to become aware of variants, as people started to see the number of cases coming out of Regina, more people were getting tested, right? And if we're just doing more tests without creating more cases, our positivity should start to shrink. Right now, positivity really hasn't budged. It's been sitting around this 9-10% for the last couple of weeks. But that's probably the first indicator where people are going to be continuing to get more and more testing done as long as we don't overload the testing system, as long as we don't sort of reach capacity. But as long as we haven't reached capacity, testing will continue to go up, and then positivity will start to shrink down because we'll be finding fewer and fewer cases as those cases in the previous generation get isolated before they have a chance to pass it on to people. So what's the first thing I'm going to be looking for? Positivity going down. And that's why I track this every day, look at the weekly and the daily positivity and test numbers, because that's going to be one of our best signals to see that we are starting to get this pandemic under control, at least in Regina.